this memory of the vibrations of the noise that I'm going to make, and I want you to feel it. You might be able to hold on to it with certain words that you've heard before, but I'm hoping that you'll let that go. Because just like Aryal, right? Is that his name? Just like he said, good science, you really gotta let go of things. And we're really gonna do good science here. Because science is only as good as its models, right? Models explain things, help us understand stuff. Right now, we have very disparate models. We're very disconnected in the way we've woven together our reality. Everything that I'm going to talk about today, you guys really are, you're the first to see it in its entirety. And it's really a big deal. And this work, it's been unveiled and I've put it together, hopefully gives us some breadcrumbs to begin to build these larger models on top of each other so that you can figure it out and reverse engineer it on your own by watching the video. And it all really began with this. So on March 3rd of my 33rd year, I had a spiritual experience that I could not explain. I got this drawing, and it really started off with, I wrote a little bit here, and then I'd draw these little things here, and then I'd do some doodles, and ultimately became this tapestry of stuff I had no idea about. I was spiritual growing up. I was a religion and philosophy major in college and thought that's what I wanted to do with my life. And really just went on my journeys, always had an inner voice, but that, apex or really impactful moment had to be primed with 3333 because it starts to tell the story that I'll explain, right? It's broken up into 4 pieces that kind of build on themselves. So this first part, I'm going to introduce a concept that was shown to me, in what is all this work that was kind of given to me that I call supernatural selection. You've already experienced it. You experience it when you have an astrological reading. You experience when you get an aha or a synchronistic moment. But it's a way to understand that there is not just a bottom-up natural selection process to reality. There's a top-down supernatural selection that uses language and what's called qualia to shift through meaning the actual biology and the naturally selected patterns of our genetics. Okay? So supernatural selection starts off where biology and physiology and the natural sciences have kind of gotten to because of our materialist way of looking at things. And it starts to build a larger picture. And then from that, that's kind of a 2-dimensional way of understanding things. It's going to build to this thing called the cube. And that's really kind of what opened all of this. It's an ancient meditation tool that I'll dive a little bit into, but it's found in everything from Kabbalah to Boda, and it's very old. And what it does is the cube ends up holding this psychosocial, spiritual user interface for our whole neuroanatomy, our archetypes, our whole lived reality, and gives us an opportunity to understand how it all works and then follow it around and experience it daily. And we're going to use different tools that we've talked about with astrology, but also I'm going to introduce tarot, and it comes to us actually through one of the first emergent languages that we have, and that's Semitic language. Then from there, the cube becomes the focus point. It becomes the middle ground that actually connects this idea of as above, so below. It becomes the medium or the Rosetta Stone that helps us understand what actually is written up in the stars and why that's there. Because we did that, and I'm going to show it to you. And then finally, this is all really neat, but then what the heck do we do with it? And that's what the READ initiative is. It really kind of started out of, because we need money, we need, how do I get these ideas out? How do I know it can impact people? And so I created a model that actually helps us understand. It was really for corporate use, how to unlock and empower your workforce. But it also is applicable to education. It's how we can build our cultures and help us understand from the inside out what's happening from the outside in. And how do we integrate all this communication from a real neuroscientific and philosophical, but also physiological level. Okay? So that's where we're going. Now, the divine remembering. What is it all about? The foundations of it is, and we've talked a lot about this weekend, but I want to reiterate for you where I'm coming from. I want to demonstrate that consciousness is fundamental, because if we can actually do that, we answer a lot of the issues that we already are struggling with within our sciences. We're very materialistic in the way that we look around the world, and there's a reason for that. Right? We need to go really deep. We need to get the measurable. We need to understand what the material realm is, because we're actually all the eternal. We're the conscious. We're here exploring that material. But how do you prove that? And that's what I'm going to show you today. It almost is impossible, but somehow humanity recognized that we could do it, we did it, and all of the stuff that you've been talking about, whether you know it or not, is the evidence that consciousness is fundamental. And because of that, existence from the bottom up is fractal. So all of these things with the 1, the 3, the 5, the 7, the 12, these are the forms and the patterns that consciousness uses to solidify the material as it comes into expression. And it just continues to repeat itself so that it can continue to find itself. Because if it didn't have those established patterns, we couldn't find meaning. Because it is patterns, it is form, it is these things that help us establish meaning. Literally, when we look at science today, how we find all of our meaning is we found correlations, and then we observe it and we see, oh, it does this. Only because it has patterns to it. It has this continual cycle or existent ingrained within it, right? And that's because consciousness and matter are working together. Motion pattern cycles, they're inherent to this reality. Because if they weren't, consciousness wouldn't be able to see itself. It would get lost in chaos. Quite literally, if everything that we understand and have made us intelligent in our lives is because there are patterns, is because there are cycles, because there is motion. Literally, your brain tunes out everything that isn't in motion. It doesn't pay attention to it. It only really focuses on those things that are changing. 1, for survival, but 2, that's where consciousness is actually poking and doing something. So there is a cycle of consciousness. And it's not that consciousness changes, it's that our biology shifts and modulates. This happens already to you. You go to sleep and wake up. Your consciousness is shifted every day based upon larger cycles that have been imprinted upon our biology for successful survival. We need sleep. We know that in the darkness we could be hurt or something could happen. The light helps us survive. So we as apex species mostly sleep at night and are awake during the day because we can actually function in that time, right? So the cycles shape our neurobiology. That's what we're going to discover, is that somehow, at some point, humanity figured this out. And something about where we are in actual space shifts and changes the ability for our neurobiology to pick up the field of consciousness. And evolution continues through consciousness. I'll show you what that means, but ultimately it's completely logical. We're an apex species because we can consciously access more patterns and pass it on than any other species. We can share the sounds that we make, the patterns of our creation, and we can build things. This was an ancient knowing. Humanity knew this, it understood it, it tracked the cycles. We literally wrote it in the stars because that's the longest storage device that we have. We can put things in monuments, we can write things on paper, we can carve them into caves, we can tell stories about them. all of those things are terrestrial. They are diminished over time, but the stars are bodies that can become dots that can become bodies in form, that can hold meaning through symbol, that can transcend all civilization, all lifetimes, so that that story can continue to hold. It becomes, and I'll show you, the longest manuscript we have. It's the oldest cave painting available to us. They encoded it and mapped it into the environment. And now the mechanism is that the universe, like how does this happen? Like when we talk about astrology and we talk about reading someone's birth chart, if your consciousness and it's stored in the physical, that these patterns in this story is here, and you come into a lifetime and you learn that, then that gives you an opportunity outside of that lifetime, and this is just an idea, don't take it with a grain of salt. But if you know that story is available on Earth, then now you can plan a life, come in, introduce that story back to yourself, so that hopefully you can remember a little bit more in the form that there is more, and maybe you can be open to that, open up the biology, and then you can actually embody the biology even more, right? Fractal symmetry is what enables this translation. So this idea of a high science, and as above, so below, this pattern, that enables the ability for a bunch of storage mechanisms. Because we have these fractal patterns at the quantum, where it's a triplet of triplets, like Scott and I met at the Science of Consciousness conference, and they're talking about these patterns that emerge when the quantum affects the microtubules in the brain, and it's a triplet of triplets. And then we see a triplet of triplets in chemistry, and we see a triplet of triplets like 33. That's what happened for me with the symbolism. We start to see that, that 33 doesn't mean anything until it does, because you had a really impactful experience. Now your nervous system is cued to those symbols. And when you see it somewhere else in some other storage device called biochemistry, you're like, I wonder what that means. Or, oh my gosh, you see it in microtubules in the brain. Then it starts to give you a starting off point, an interest or a curiosity that you can then consciously begin to choose to go a bit deeper. And all that is fractal symmetry, just patterns. Said another way, the cube ends up helping us decode this, because it holds in its various mechanisms so much information that we've collected and stored as a collective over time, through the tarot, through astrology, through our glyphs, and now what we're unlocking with our material sciences. Now, the high science, this knowledge, all of it, because it's been passed on, it got formed into an idea of as above, so below, because we needed a way to store all of this information fractally and continue to pass it on. So because it's fractal, you can literally put one little bit of an idea into something, like a 3, and begin to extract it as you stumble on other things. Is this making sense? It begins to create an ability to see pattern recognition, which is our apex ability as a species, on a colossal level. And then when we create language to explain other things, and we start to see those correspondences, now we can create a web. We can create an understanding of how all of these things start to work together. And that's what the cube will help us understand. The science then, because we have this cube, because of the high science that I mapped out, it becomes empirical. So it's really cool, that we've got astrology, and I can tell you about your life, and you can experience this, but that's very subjective. And science really hates that stuff when it becomes materialist, or when it becomes about materialism. Meaning, I want to be able to watch this and see what it does, and then watch where it goes, and I want to be able to measure it, right? That's what we're really focused on. Well, because we have something like the cube, and we can understand it through our neuroscience, we can understand it through astronomy, because I'm going to show you that actually not only does it connect to your brain, this cube thing, it also connects to our ancient sites, 1-to-1, which means we have a complete as above, so below connection of these patterns. And so therefore it can become predictable and observable. And we end up finding this multiple times through ancient sites around the world over the last 12,000 years. in all major cultures. Same patterns, same connections to the stars, same mythologies. Modern research then, through neuroscience, can validate all the stories we've been telling. So because we've been using astrology, which is the actual high science because it's the information stored in the stars, right? I'm not taking anything away from what Alan says. It's not simply that these vibrational things are happening. It's literally that we recognized it and then we decided to make those dots mean something. And then say, oh, when the wind blows from this thing, when the cosmic wind blows from this angle, you start to feel that when Mars is here. We start to experience these subtle vibrations, but then when we language them and we put them in a storage device, they start to become a book that we can begin to decipher. And that modern research, because we have now neuroscience, because we now have psychology, and we can start to connect those things, it becomes something that we can deeply understand through our materialist perspective. And the revelation is then that mankind is far older. I can track it 60,000 years that we had this high information. We've rediscovered through this work, this map, and it shows that eternal life is empirical. And what that means is that, no, your consciousness, like us experiencing this right now, it lives like it's physical. It lives like, oh, I'm a material thing. But all I'm doing is making a bunch of noise from my vocal cords that's moving air, and it's falling on the hairs in your ears, and then that's vibrating nerves, that's cueing electricity, that's cueing chemical, so that you can pull up the memory that you've had. But all that is on the conscious level. The meaning of the noise that I'm making is just consciousness. You have always been living in it. That is the Aquarian age. The recognition that you are the fish swimming in the water. We've been so numb to the fact that, hey, it's inherent. Consciousness is it that we're walking in. Now we get the revelation of, oh wow, we've been in water this whole time. We just thought we were physical. And somehow that water emerged from us. The purpose of the cycle, why it's so important, is because if you just had consciousness all the time, if it wasn't a cycle, you didn't lose it. So it wouldn't be obvious. And because there's a cycle where you lose it, you lose the deep connection, and you go deeper into the genetic biology. And then you come out of it and remember it again. It shows that consciousness was there and you were modulating to it. It was already available always, but it was hidden at a time, and then you could observe it at a time. And so that helps you understand, oh, there is a thing called consciousness. And oh, it's always been there. If you were always there, there would be no differentiation. There would be no distinction. So it actually shows a movement in consciousness, and now we can measure it, we can see it's a pattern, and actually recognize it's a thing. And then through remembering, you'll see that we end up evolving. So, we've been going through the darkened phase of this, as I'll show you. And that's the quintessential veil, right? Christ dies on the cross, and what does it say? The veil is ripped. When Penelope is weaving at the end of the story of Odysseus, she's weaving at night, and then she pulls the thread, and it's gone. Humanity's always thinking it's doing something, but then it's really not. And this veil that we've woven, this imprint of reality that we've lived into, has really helped us get to the point that we're in right now. But the whole point was just to be able to get some awareness within the biology so that now, as a conscious collective, we could start moving through the biology to help heal the biology and actually continue the ability to manifest on the plane. Because otherwise, this species, if left up to its own devices, would be the hunter that kills everything in the forest and wipes it all out. So, we're going to pull it, buckle up, let the journey begin. Supernatural selection. We've already talked about it. Everything is energy. Energy is just an idea, it's not a thing. It's just the concept of the will and the ability to do work. And then we put things on top of it, like we make it quarks and gluons and fermions and baryons and all of this stuff, and atoms and gases and, all of it. At the end of the day, everything is energy in some pattern, cycle, form, or structure. And so another way that you can look at it is memory. Everything is memory. It's in a memory of how consciousness moved, how it created a pattern, how it created a cycle that lasted long enough within the material, that was in a form that subsisted long enough that it could be recognized again. And so this is the idea of supernatural selection. I'm not going to go into it a lot because I want to, recognize time. But the idea is that existence, which is what we're all in, right? At the end of the day, existence is the eternal thing. And that it equals E cubed, because I wanted to be cute, and say E equaled E cubed instead of just MC squared. Existence is broken into two ideas, two concepts for you. There is the expression aspect and the experience aspect. There is the expression, which is bottom up. This is a biological expression, and consciousness is the experience. And they're two sides of the same coin. This bottom up is the concept, and why most of our science is very materially driven, because it's the idea of I think, therefore I am. I think, therefore I am. That's the expression, because we can think in our biology. And therefore I come into an idea of, I am. I'm a thing, right? That was Descartes' idea. I'm pretty sure it was Descartes, right? Yeah. What? Yeah, right. That was his idea, is like, how can I even prove that I exist? Well, I think, and therefore I am. But that was Descartes. That was a projected identity concept built on the memory capabilities of the genetic species. And I'll unpack that in a little bit. I am, therefore, I think, is the top-down idea of that. Because we are, because the I am is the I am, then therefore it just does things. It experiences things. And the expressions that have been created as it experienced things allow it to continue to progress upward towards more understanding of the conscious spectrum that it is. Because existence is unified in consciousness. It is not, we can create gradations of it, like we were talking about with the sevens, right? Those are gradations of the spectrum. They're not different things as much as we've just created them as that's red or that's blue or that's orange so that we can understand it a bit more deeply, but they're involved in a unified spectrum. And so as we look at reality, we'll begin to be able to see that, every form has different ability in its expression to experience this spectrum of consciousness. Go back. To understand itself again, more fully. And so we have this idea of being and consciousness. Being is this potential to do work. What do I want to be? I want to be something. So it's still until it moves. And I'll explain that a little bit more. And then that comes from the bottom-up expression through this material physical capabilities. The quantum creates the material functions and the patterns of the body. And then consciousness, through this whole spectrum, works in a top-down fashion through this immaterial mental capabilities that we talked about with the greater planes, the higher planes, through the cosmos and through the mind to unite through spirit so that it can unlock deeper understandings of the conscious universe. So again, natural selection is the bottom-up creative process. Supernatural selection is the top-down aspect of creative process. Now, we got to start abstractly to get this stuff, okay? Like, we got to start really simply to start to build it. And then it goes really deep. This is everything. And I'm going to go over everything many times in different, like, metaphors. But there's no distinction. It's just a white, besides the red. It's just white. There's no, it's all what you could say coherent. Okay? It's all possibilities, and I want you to imagine all possibilities in that, but they're all in the same waveform. They're all in the same flow, in the same pattern. They're unified. Nothing is distinct. They're all potential. And then all of a sudden, something moves. Another example would be a drop of a rock in a pond. And so you can see that's the idea of something coming into form. It decoheres, is what it's called from the quantum level. So the quantum, everything's unified in potential until it decoheres from that and gets out of phase with everything else. And then it becomes probable within a metastable environment, meaning it becomes an emergent form, but that form is contingent on a larger set of patterns on whether it's going to actually be able to subsist or not. And this portion that comes in has a resonance that it resonates with. All of this still stays, but then this has a larger resonance, just like a ripple on a pond, if you can understand. But if you just left it there, it's still in the form of chaos. It's still not distinct. Is it going to last forever? It's a blip. It's a moment. And so then what we need is some sort of containment. Okay? And this is starting to grow into the idea of sacred geometry. In our mythologies, the way this pattern that I'm unfolding for you right now is the pattern of I think it's I'm trying to think of the name specifically, but it's the riddle of the Sphinx. So I don't know if you know the riddle of the Sphinx really quickly. It's 1, 4, 2, 3. And I really hope I'm getting that right. I'm almost positive it's 1, 4, 2, 3. But we start to see that riddle, that pattern play out in a lot of things. Because when you solve it, when the hero solves it, I mean, what he says is that, that's the story of man when he's born, when he's at 1, right here. Then he's walking on 4, he's crawling, and then he moves to the 2 and the 3. But the point is, that's really literally the riddle of creation, because when that quantum thing comes out of coherence into a decoherent emergent form, what ends up happening is the 4 forces contain it and actually give it expression. But that's also like the 4 ACGT of our genetics. These are patterns that end up playing out, that create and bring up the conscious patterns and make them have form. And this larger metastable environment that has found form is what allows that to then begin to have existence, motion, movement, change, life. It doesn't just go right back into coherence. It doesn't go back into chaos. It now has memory. We can begin to watch it and have patterns of it. Some of them, when we look at them at CERN, they pop in and out faster than that. But what you got to realize is that is literally what is happening always. The moment wasn't a big bang, even though we'll talk about it a little bit. The moment's happening all the time. New moment, new moment, new moment. Everything is exploding. That black hole out of everything else is exploding and moving back into the form that the metastable environment allows it to stay in. And this, because it now has a trajectory, it now has a 1 and a 2. It has a point, a beginning and an end. So 1, 4, 2, and then 3. So really abstract, and if you've been in the esoteric sciences, you've seen this before. Where now, because we have a triangle, we can have depth. We can begin to understand, have deeper knowledge. How does this develop through the aspects? Different channels of information, RGB, right? Now, how as a human do we get to have our experiences? We're made up of biological, psychological, social, and spiritual aspects. You have a body, right? You can get information from it. You have a mind. Everything that I'm talking about. Purple elephant. That's not in the biology. But you can see it. It's not as tangible as the physical, but it's somewhere. That's your mind. That's what we call the mind. The social, the ability for us to communicate, purple elephant, came because we have a social construct that allows us to have language so that we can pass on ideas and share experiences. Now, how do we expand beyond that? That's the spiritual. And all of these have studied models that we're going to go over. With biology, I'm going to talk a little bit about brain and human development. Psychology, talk about very lightly because everybody's kind of talked about it already a little bit. Maslow, Keegan, Kruger, Lovinger, all of these are ego development models, psychological development models. In the social, we have things like moral foundations to understand how the experiences of the biopsycho end up impacting and playing with the larger collective, and that it develops in a pattern. And there's transitions, there's models that we see that experiences cause different values to take shape. Because the collective is having those experiences, it allows for the next one to begin to emerge. And then finally with spiritual, I'm going to show you involution and evolution, because if everything is consciousness, then how does it actually come into form? And then how does it evolve through that form so that it continues to grow and develop and work? And all of these work in fractal patterns of each other. So biological, the material manifested consciousness. We already talked about Big Bang, but I wanted you to see this whole picture because this is the whole picture of consciousness. The spectrum of consciousness, exploring through material the conscious spectrum of memory. We have the Big Bang, and then it starts to take on form and understand till finally, this is large form understanding. We get to a place where we can have a local terrestrial environment that then has grown patterns that ends up in the ability for a pattern that has enough memory that it can reflect back on all of this. So, existence is the expression of experiences. All of these are expressions of experiences for the experiences of expression. So you can go back and you can have an experience of all those expressions. Because the idea of evolution is this. Evolution depends on greater awareness, because if I understand my environment, I can make choices and I can interact with my environment in a way that allows me to keep going in that environment. But in so doing, I create patterns that allows me to access greater consciousness. Because the more consciousness I have, the greater I can understand my environment, the greater I can imprint and protect myself from the environment, and then the greater my genetics can persist and pass on within the environment. So survival of the fittest depends on accessing higher levels of consciousness, because that creates greater levels of awareness. So, everything, again, bam, you emerge. Imagine this is everything. There's no way that it is, but just imagine. Isn't that a superpower you have? You can imagine something. Yeah. This little shape literally becomes the cosmos. Breaking apart everything. There's things that we know, right? Like Like I know that I know my name is Hart. I know that I have 2 children right now, right? So there are areas that you know that you know. And there are areas that you know that you don't know, right? And really we live in that dichotomy of life. And that shields us from the fact that there are things far greater that we don't know. We don't know. And that's what our society actually has built through our species. It's built an imprinted, projected reality that allows us to live and move and have our being in a safe, productive way, shielding us from all of these unknown unknowns that could be just right around the corner, but they're not because we have great roads and we pushed that lion or that wolf or that coyote somewhere else, right? And we've got these 4 walls in this building. And it's your brain that really helps you interpret between all of those things within the physical form, okay? And your nervous system is what allows you to read all of that. What you're actually reading is energy in many, many, many different forms in formation. Energy, information. Energy in formation. Our nervous system is what helps us have those experiences. And we actually have 2, really, there's probably 3 if you understand polyvagal theory. But we have at least 2 ways that we can delineate the way we receive information. By and large, we receive it through the sympathetic, which is this idea of fight or flight. You've probably heard that. Fear-driven. And there's rest and digest. And that's the calm, receptive response. And nature has optimized to understand energy in form, in biology, through these 2 systems and interpret reality. And they give us 2 different experiences on the back end of life. When we operate primarily from the sympathetic, it prepares the body to react and it moves through quick unconscious actions. There's a chronic stress response. It's impaired emotional regulation, psychological wear and tear, narrow focus, get away from that stimulus. But it's also digestion and other things, so it has real practical application. Then there's parasympathetic. Parasympathetic is really what's cued when we use meditation. Parasympathetic allows the mind to create and unlock higher levels of and higher order of thought. Sympathetic does not allow that. Sympathetic goes back into the past. Parasympathetic allows you to be here and understand and observe and then respond. It's cooperation-based where sympathetic is competition-based. It enhances, literally when we use the parasympathetic and practices, it enhances our stress recovery, improves our cognitive function, greater emotional regulation, increased focus, long-term thinking, physical restoration and health. All of these things are what happen when we start to practice and take actions that cue the parasympathetic. So quite literally, you can see nature optimizes for this response. But our reality has optimized to produce this response. So we need a change. And that's what we're all talking about. Now, your brain has different frequencies that it vibrates at. Remember, it's an electrochemical converter. You have neurons that are electrical. There's all this electromagnetic waves and fields that are literally measurable in your brain that these neurons create. And these waves end up helping you access different experiences through this biology of the larger reality. When you're operating in a high gamma, that's when you're going to start experiencing higher perception, learning, problem solving. These are tough. That's a tough state to get into. Those are long-time meditators usually are in that. Now, some people have. I mean, I've measured myself at that at certain times. I have an EEG monitor that I use. But beta is where we mostly live. We're awake, we're living life, high and low beta. We're in stress response, we're working in alert thinking, excitement. But when we go into meditation, we start to move into alpha and maybe some theta, because we're starting to calm down and take our system to another state, another part of what it's already capable of producing. But on most of our conscious level, because we've been living in this physical reality and the imprints and the patterns of it, we end up really staying here where this is all accessible, but we don't go into it. And finally, delta, that's usually sleep. The brain. I want you to understand that you have different areas of your brain. Your brain's not just one big lumped thing. We've been able to have experiments where we, taken tumors out and certain things have happened. We have had stroke victims and we can measure through different responses what happens in the brain so we can start to pinpoint where the functions of the brain are, okay? But I want you to just make sure you make notes that you understand this has a function, that has a function, this has a function, that. Back here it does things, front. You can see that all of these have been mapped already by our sciences. And that the biology, the brain, develops in a certain pattern. It develops inside out, back to front, right to left, bottom to top. Okay? Yeah. And there's an imprint of our evolution within the brain. Now, the triune model, people like to argue about it. I'm not specifically saying that we literally got this brain from a snake, because the snake has other aspects. It's just not as strong in that species, in that genetic representation. And most of the traits that we found within the cerebellum and the brainstem are really what we can observe within the genetic expression of the reptiles. And they were the first genetic expression to rule the planet. They were the genetic expression in the genetic form that persisted for a very long time, but they didn't reach the biological capabilities to have a high enough consciousness to bring themselves together and defend against an external existential crisis. And so therefore, they lost their rule. That's, the comet hitting, or whatever you want to, however you want to explain how the dinosaurs didn't get hit, or didn't persist. But we have a reptilian brain, a mammalian brain, and then we have the human neocortex. The limbic system, the mammalian brain, is really tied to this idea of connection. The limbic system is memory, it's emotion, it's the ability to create deep memory and interaction with others. That's what the limbic helps us modulate and control. And then the human neocortex, this outer higher layer, top down, allows us to control the machine within the machine. And what I mean by that is by thought. Because we have a neocortex, you can think about something and it will change and cascade the chemicals that are produced within the system. This is literally what you experience when you watch a movie. You're watching a movie and thinking about that movie, having a physical experience of that movie because you feel in it. This is what stories allow us to do, is change the system within the system. Now watch this. Pretty neat. See that?
Cool.
Yeah, see that? Pretty cool. Look at that. Holy smokes. And that's literally the human experience. We're trying to get out of the cave, but we're so freaking scared about the snake in the grass and the stuff that's going on out there that we're afraid, well, what if that thing picks me up?
Yeah.
But that thing picking you up is the thing that can set you free. You just don't know it. Because our limbic system drives a lot of our reality. And so we as humans develop over time in different patterns. And this is really important. And why it's important is because your neurobiology is what allows you to have experiences, right? You get that. Over time, your neurobiology is enabled through experiences for greater and greater experiences should you so choose. But if you don't allow that, those physical capabilities for those further experiences will not come online. You will remain psychologically stuck because the brain has not been allowed to develop those capacities more fully. Okay? So from 0 to 2, we're very much sensory motor integration, very back-brained, trying to figure out our world with motion. There's a lot of synaptogenesis is what it's called, new synapses, new connections. And then we move to limbic system coming on, remember, inside out, back to front, right? The limbic and the emotional systems are happening. We're very imaginative. Then you have cognitive differentiation. So what ends up happening is now we've had some experiences between 0 and 6. So then from like 6 to 12-ish, what ends up happening is the brain starts saying, I've had enough experiences with my environment. So what I'm going to do now is start cutting to make experiences a little more distinct. They're still very disparate. They need to be disparate. Why? Because when our brain wants to create the ability for an individualized awareness, remember, individualized awareness is extremely important in survival, because if you have an individual, you have an external that it needs to survive in. So now there's greater awareness because there's a me and a this and a out there and another. I now can actually move the vehicle better to get out of the way. Instead of, if there wasn't, I might just walk right up to that thing that could kill me and I don't care, and then I just die. And my genes are not passed on from the bottom up, if that makes sense. So the brain has learned how to conceptualize things by putting things in very distinct networks after they're pruned that are integral for the continued growth of this awareness. Then there's adolescent exploration. As you have these experiences, now there's a growth and identity that develops, and it's able to explore its world now because it's got some really strong experiences of concepts, and the networks are strong. Then finally, your prefrontal, remember back to front, the front of your brain starts to develop and you can have logic. But look how long that takes. Really, 24 is a good estimate of that we're actually gonna have some awareness about who we really might kind of be, right? But then around 30 to 40, what's really neat is we're just discovering this. What your brain ends up doing is it ends up, instead of having these disparate kingdoms of ideas, which is really inefficient, energy consumption-wise, right? It starts to consolidate them again. So quite literally, you spend 40 years in the wilderness trying to sort stuff out, till finally your brain now has enough experiences that it can start to have higher expressions and higher understandings of things. So this is the idea that you can kind of begin to build, where we have a lot of classical sciences, a lot of classical models, this metastable environment. We thought that was real for a long time. But then we realized, oh, that's just a bunch of patterns that subsist and allow us to have predictability. This quantum world of emergence, oh my gosh. And then all of these forms end up creating this ability for finally a genetic expression that is biologically capable of holding deep internal memory. Because remember, the more memory you have, the more ability you have for awareness and understanding your environment. And we've created social constructs that help build that and keep it coming online. All of that biological, builds the ability for a psychological. We're the only species on the planet that has this capacity to the depth that we have. There's no other species on this planet having a convention on a Sunday talking about this stuff, right? So evolution builds these basic structures and biological information so that it can have pattern recognition. And the more pattern recognition builds the higher memory capacities, then that builds higher neural complexity. Then finally we have this ability to have thought and ideation. And thought and ideation creates the ability to have self-projection. There's a you and a me, because there's a thing in here. And then that increases the ability to have a conservation of genes. Are you following? That's the story of the survival of the fittest. And so this individual capacity has its own flow. Our psychology has its own flow of evolution. When we're children, we're very self-centric. The biology for survival purposes in its most basic form is very self-centric. The selfish gene is a great idea because genes only care about passing on their pattern. And then it moves to group-centric because the first thing that emerges after self is the idea of a larger capacity. We need to have group. That's what the mammals really contributed to, is the ability for this larger to imprint on the biology so that the biology could persist. Because when there's just the self, we found it ends up stagnant. So how we know this is there are children in orphanages that aren't touched. They're fed. They get the nutrients, but they're not cared for. And their brain ends up becoming stagnated, stifled in its development. And there's a certain age around 6, 7 that they found you can't overcome it anymore. And they'll stay in that lower state of expression biologically. And so their psychology can't progress. So then it moves to a skill-centric. Now that we've got the group, let me express myself and let me learn from the group. I'm going to build and I'm going to understand and I'm going to develop a skill. And then that skill allows me to have a self-determining aspect within the group and the world. And then from there, now that I have a self-determining, things don't always work out for me. So I'm going to start questioning because I get a larger experience of my reality. And I start to, there's more. And then that leads to real self-actualization. And that self-actualization then helps you understand the construct, helps you understand all of these different disparate kingdoms and how they work together, till finally you can develop into a unitive consciousness, what we've kind of been talking about. And many people have recognized this. Many people in their own way. Maslow talked about it with physiology all the way up to self-actualization, self-transcendence. Keegan, he has this really cool, you should look it up. He has a really cool kind of how consciousness builds through awareness, where it is that self-centric, but that helps build the concept of a me, then a you, and then now there's another, since there's a you, now there's other me's and you's, which is a group, and now there's group with groups, and then now we have a collective, but I'm able to look at the collective, and now that's construct aware, and then I can impart and impact that collective. Lovinger has the ego development theory of the different stages that the ego goes through in her mind. And then we just looked at the Cook-Greuter. But these are all the different, as the brain develops, the different things that allow us to come online. So do you see how what I'm starting to do is I'm starting to build from that bio, and I'm starting to add fractally on top of it what's able to emerge through the different patterns as the experiences happen. Is that making sense? Because from 0 to 2 we have this, our brain is developing, we then can have the psychological experiences of this. Attachment, trust, body emotion. Do you get that? And then because adolescent expansion happens and prefrontal cortex integration happens, we can start to have self-reflection and internal beliefs. But as a child, you can't have internal beliefs because there's no you yet. Right? You haven't gone through those experiences to build those neural frameworks. You don't have the foundation internal. All of that is to build this concept called qualia. That might be new for a lot of people. Qualia is just the idea of subjective human experience. A way to explain it is red. I have an experience of red. There is no way for me to explain red to you till you have experienced red. And then we can start talking about it. You may have a way different experience of red, but at least, I don't know that, but we can kind of talk about it and we'll develop the ability to share the subjective experience I'm having with the subjective experience you're having as we explore and unlock an objective external. Is that making sense? What's important about that is qualia is bioactive. Qualia is just thought. It's subjective internal, but it shifts and changes the biology. Through cognitive science, we've shown that thought, which is electrochemical, changes genetic expression. Because when you're watching a movie, and it's a love scene. Dopamine, gets fired, and you're having a love experience in here. When you have a horror movie and you're watching it, cortisol fires, and you're having an oh my gosh experience in here. And that cues different proteins, different genetic responses. That is the key, the mechanism of consciousness shifting biology. Is that making sense? Subjective experience has a physical impact on the biological memory of genetic expression. Social is how we store this. Because if you come out, your baby, and there's no external, you're just left up, that's reptilian. Mammalian, there's a constraint with the biology where you got to feed the baby, which creates connection, deeper chemical response, deeper memory, deeper engagement and attachment, longer survival. But also when we start creating language and what's called mimetic structure, that ends up imprinting ideas and awareness on the neurobiology, which allows the biology to get up to speed quicker. Does that make sense? As I teach my children mathematics, they're having those experiences. It's taken mankind a long time to get those ideas. But by passing it on through the social, through the teachers, we now allow that biology to integrate with the psychology of the social imprint. But also, that social input, sorry. Oh, no, great. You good? You sure? What's really important is that social is the thing that gives you you. Because you didn't come out. I didn't come out and say, my name is Hart. Hart is a memory mnemonic. It's a sound from the social that allows my biology to have a focal point of memory to begin to have experiences. And then it grows from there. And how we've done this, how we've helped ourselves navigate, is our mythologies, our stories. Because our stories are what provide that quality of subjective experience so that awareness starts to recognize things. Because when we use language, we prime. Remember I told you about that 3-3. Well, that's just a shape. But because I had an experience with it and I had the language and the idea, now that can start to happen and somebody can talk to me about threes. And now I can recognize threes. But that all comes through the language and the story. Because my biology is primed to recognize it. That's marketing. You literally, when you walk into a store and they have fragrances, it's priming your biology to enjoy or not enjoy. When you see a subconscious drawing in marketing, it's cueing your unconscious to operate in a certain way. Okay? We've used this in politics recently.
Oh, yeah.
How we did that, Joseph Campbell, I'm not going to go into it, but he mapped out our mythologies and he called it things called the hero's journey. What that does is provide a construct. It provides an outline for the awareness of the biology to move through the experiences necessary to finally create a hero. A really defined, unique, individualized identity expression within the biology. We've also created these other great models called integral theory, and AQUAL is this mapping, but it has spiral dynamics and it has the ego development theory. But we've mapped a lot of these on because our society, because it's made up of individuals that are made up of biology, and those follow a progression, society in its imprint actually has a pattern to it too. It has value systems that it develops through. And those value systems end up mapping perfectly with the biopsychosocial of our mythologies. So, an example of that is a child comes out and he learns his ordinary world. But in order to expand beyond that, because you don't want to stay stuck, you got to have some sort of call to adventure. But then your imagination and your worldview, everything, that's the supernatural aid. The higher, you can't explain it. The everything can fly, right? And so we started telling stories with these ideas within it, and I'm going to unpack those stories so you see them a little better. But then in order to really understand the world, we can't stay in the supernatural. We got to cross the threshold into the real world. And that's the meeting of the mentor. That's middle childhood, this idea where you really start to explore your power self, loyalty-driven ideas of justice, right and wrong, all of this stuff that the larger world, that your family can't just show you, that you have to meet somebody outside of you, outside of your group to teach you. And then you go through the road of trials where you're starting to test these things out and it's really starting to form inside your brain. Then now that there's a you, a real me going on within this rule self of I'm the emperor of my world, you approach this innermost cave because you're the controller of this world, but there are also things about this world that can fall apart, and you got to challenge and work with those things and deal with them. And then there's a whole progression upwards to where finally you challenge yourself at the dark night of the soul. The spirit starts to move in, which is what I'm going to talk about here in a minute. Finally, hopefully you have a unity of self where your apotheosis, you recognize God and man within you, that Christ itself is there, and then you become the master of two worlds. So our mythologies actually scaffold over time the conscious development of the group. And then finally we have the aspect of spiritual. Spirituality is the first function that emerges within these value systems. So once we come online, we have our basic needs met. All of a sudden, now that we can domesticate plants and animals, we realize, oh crap, there are things that can destroy those plants and animals. So we recognize there's something higher that we can't control. And so immediately within the group, after we've been fed, and after we've had those basic subsistive things taking care of the animal aspects of ourselves, consciousness comes online and we realize there's a shite ton more going on. And so spirituality is the first thing that actually gets explored and emerged within collective groups. And we call them gods. Because those are the things we can't control. Now spirituality is important because it ends up holding all of the symbols that qualia uses to upgrade. Because as you have an experience, that subjective thing, when you're having that experience, you can't progress without something called a metaphor. Because the way that your brain works, it doesn't like new information. But a metaphor is like a Trojan horse. It holds a bridge within your brain that allows your neural connections, because they're multifunctional, they have many different connections, and that's not one-to-one. Your brain's not one-to-one, it has many connections. Those connections are tied to different frameworks that you don't always use, but a metaphor makes this fire with this where it wouldn't normally. Okay? But it's really hard when you have a very fixed left brain experience of reality to allow those metaphors to come in, because your left brain interprets language as a factual, logical thing. And so you must start to work consciously to bring on the right hemisphere. So what ends up happening with supernatural selection is this. We have all of this with natural selection, right? You get that. But then through symbol, synchronicity, spiritual expansion, that kind of stuff starts to cue a whole cascade of top-down impact. That idea with the 3-3, remember I told you March 3rd of my 33rd year.
Right.
That's just a form. That doesn't mean anything. It's a shape, right? It's a bunch of lines in a curved fashion. But then it becomes a 3, and that's really kind of, okay, that has its whole other context. And then 3-3, and then, oh, I'm 33, and then 3. It's priming my nervous system. So then when I have an experience in my life where I'm going to talk to a group of an investor group or a business meeting, I feel like I'm running late. I might be a little nervous. I'm driving. My sympathetic is cued on, I got to get there. But then because my nervous system is cued, I tend to look over and I see a license plate that said 333, I see you. And now it becomes a communication tool. Do you understand? And that is already always happening in your life every moment. You just have to learn the language. And that's supernatural selection, because what it did is it automatically cues my nervous system out of sympathetic response, because that's tied to a spiritual aspect and a rest and digest portion of my state. And I'm saying, oh, you got me. This is perfect timing, because I was running late, I thought. But no, I was perfect timed for that license plate. That means absolutely freaking nothing. But it does to me. And that's supernatural selection. Because what happened is my qualia shifted. I wasn't in this lower state. Now I am cueing a whole different cascade of biological responses. I am now able to open up a whole new future because I'm able to receive and speak from a peaceful place. Is this making sense? And it was just a symbol. But then from there, my cognition and my attention changes. My brain literally is rewritten. My neural frameworks are changed. They are not in the state of, I need to produce something. They're in the state of, I need to receive something. I am being acted through. Does that make sense? And then from there, my neurochemistry has changed. Cellular and epigenetic memory has changed, meaning I'm walking into that meeting totally different. Epigenetics is how the environment changes. So my interaction with those people out of a stress state is going to be totally different than out of a relaxed and restful state. So now their genetic response is changed. So I am impacting the environment. Does this make sense? Then my habits and my environment are changes. Somehow GPT doubled that, and I didn't catch it. And then there's a genetic inheritance that's passed on as we continue to do these things. Making sense? Fantastic. So what we get to see is that natural selection is not the whole story. Natural selection is the environmental quality that's persisted within the memory.
In progress.
Oh. Natural selection is the memory pattern of all of these choices of the myriad metastable environment players that are happening. Big words, I know. Supernatural selection is the individual being able to impact that in a higher low way. And the conscious, the higher awareness, as we work through experiences for the biology to receive this more deeply, is what allows the higher to come in more fully. Does that make sense? Because as I'm in more of a restful state, my brain is in a different response. I'm able to receive different higher levels of the already always happening conscious spectrum. But it can't be perceived when the biology is in a sympathetic response. And what I mean by that is biology picks up consciousness. You don't shift consciousness. You shift biology. Biology then imprints collectively that understanding of consciousness. So by shifting the biology, you shift the access that the biology has of the already always consciousness. Is that making sense? And that something is you, is me, is us. That's why you embody. So that you can impact the memory of the memories. We've gone over all of that. That's our sciences, hard sciences now. Now this is the metaphysical stuff of consciousness involving itself in the material world so that it can evolve not only itself, but also the biology, which is the memory patterns of consciousness. And so it goes through these different patterns. When we look at the biopsychosocial models of the imprinted pattern, you find that there is the process of differentiation. So consciousness is unified. It must come into a form of differentiation. Literally, I am a differentiated form of physical consciousness right now that we call Hart, if that's making sense. But I started as a baby. I differentiated myself from my mother, right? Differentiation, and then from differentiation, it starts to identify its environment. Because it needs to imprint upon the biology, and that's what the social helps to happen. And then from identification, there's enough understanding and memory that it can be domesticated. And that domestication allows there for ability to be individualized within the group. Okay? Individualization is the process, the last part of the process of that involution. Then, now that I've got externally driven individualization, I can now have an internally driven evolution. Spirit can start awakening from the inside. Yeah, exactly. And then from there, when we get this internalization, we have this experience of a realization. Oh, wow. That's cool. That's what happens when you get a reading. Someone has a realization of something. But you got to do something with that realization. It's got to have an impact on the choices of the individualized aspect of memory that the biology holds, the identity. And that's where we get to move into the higher, where we start to learn how to actualize these concepts that we've realized through spirituality. And then we can integrate them so that we can finally move through unification. And by unifying, we can move back through that process and become involved physically with the rest of the world. Exactly. Oh, 15. Perfect. I gotta move fast. Mind, body, spirit, this is our social construct. You can take a picture of it. It's fascinating how our survival skills built in our narratives. You have an imprint from the social construct that develops at you. Okay?
Thank you.
Okay. Now I'm going to fly because I haven't even introduced the cue.
Let me go get the recording.
Okay. We've told the story through Big Bang, but we also have this in our creation stories when we read it metaphorically. Remember, metaphors are really important. Adam and Eve, that story. Adam, Aleph in the blood. Aleph is the A and the D is the Dam. That's Aleph in the blood. God in the blood, so God in the genetics. All in the creation, the unknown, unknowable, Aleph, in the blood. So we have this bottom-up genetic code that then begins, and that Adam, there's a play on words in Genesis 1. In the Hebrew, it's Adam and Adamah. It's like human from the hummus. Adamah is like the terrestrial dirt. Okay? Then it moves into the Ish and Ishia. Ish is like the husband. That's the masculine, the active portion. So the genetics begin to be, able to move and act and name the external environment. And then out of itself is born a receptive feminine nature. And that's that spiritual aspect of the ability to receive the higher information. We told this story. I want you to understand, when we look at our earliest gods, those earliest gods, their aspects have the exact same personality traits that we've identified the left and right hemispheres of our brain have. Enki, our Enlil, is very structured. He's the god of order, authority, and control. That's our left brain. Right brain, holistic, intuitive, and creative. That's Enki. The gods above and the gods below. Why that's important is because we've been working to build the hero. We've been working to develop these aspects of our brain so that we can bring on the memory patterns of the biology so that consciousness can actually impact the physical from the inside out. We can see it in our midst. Reptile. Mammal. Human. Plays out in the garden with the tree and the snake. This is the idea of the mind, body, and the spirit. When we take this two-dimensional, the mind really works with the known unknowns, really works to facilitate the known unknowns into the known worlds of the body through the memory, and move it into the known knowns. Social construct are what holds it. You get your sense of self by the soul reflecting through these three mirrors, and then the social reflecting back. The spirit is what holds the realm of the unknown unknowns. How you access it is work through your judgment. Because as you let go of your judgment, spirit is able to help you understand things you didn't know. And it does that through your choice to surrender. As it does it can actually move things from the unknown, what the soul is working with, into the mind so it can start to be worked with in the physical through these symbols and through these actions. Why would it want to do that? Because when it does that, it starts to unlock a thing called the unknown knowns. It remembers. You already knew this stuff. Now, we can take this two-dimensional model. I told you I'm going to fly. We can take this two-dimensional model and we can extract it. So these lines become a three-dimensional XYZ axis. You following that? Okay? And what it ends up creating is the internal axis of a cube. You see that? Okay. When you take that memory, remember I said memory, judgment, and choice, and you look at the cube, memory is the ancient, these are called the three mothers. Mem, Aleph, and Shin. And this is how you begin to build the cube through Kabbalah. Mem is memory. Steen is judgment, fire. And then Aleph is choice, air. And you've got water, fire, and air. Those are the three elements that build earth. And Aleph, Mem, and Shin, memory, judgment, and choice, are the three elements that build you. We get it because we have this meditation tool that says, hey, you need to go and reflect on our ancient language and put our ancient symbols in certain places in space. North, south, east, and west, up and down. So you get cardinal directions. Does that make sense? But it looks like a big mess till you connect them, and then it builds this cube where you've got specific placements of these things. See that? And these things have meaning. So you see this right here? That's called Ein. And its ancient glyph is an eye. And it means to look, no, shade. And you're said, put it west down. See that? Right? Well, I started to recognize, because there's a path that goes around it, and this path ends up unfolding those biopsychosocial spiritual models that I talked to you about. As you connect all of these things, they unfold in the same fashion. But I started to recognize that the meanings of all of these things really connected deeply to the way that our brain is structured. And then I recognized you can convert those glyphs. Remember these glyphs? You can convert them through correspondence to tarot and astrology. Got it? So this thing right here ends up creating the tarot. Then you get archetypes. Do you understand? Tarot's archetypes. It's a bunch of meaning. Guess what? All 22 of where you're told to put these archetypes perfectly match the area of your brain right underneath them when you put the brain in the cube. What it shows is that because we have archetypical functions of our brain, those archetypical functions become expressions that we then talk about and interact with. But also we had a high science of our neurobiology, and we used those archetypes through the stars to cue those aspects of your brain so that they could be manually manipulated as you meditate, as you work with them. Does that make sense? Now, it's not as far-fetched as you think. There's a scientist out of UCLA called Dario Nardi that he did studies on EEG monitoring, and he began to build archetypes of the brain and was saying, if I could take these archetypes and find connections with them, I could develop the personalities, because those aspects and how the brain is wired is what builds the personality. Does that make sense? So you take these basic functions and then connect them in a certain way, and they become a person based upon the experiences the person has. He has 16. His 16 match up perfectly to my 22. I have more. But we have more from 2,000 plus years ago through the cube. Walking through the cube, I wish I could do it completely. But what you do is you start off here on the lover's card, where you're unified, and then the beam splits. So remember, energy information. What this becomes is a three-dimensional model. It's like a hologram of how energy is interpreted at different points as you follow it. And we learned how to navigate this, and we stored it. Okay? I can't walk through it all because I got to get to the good stuff. Okay? But you can walk all the way through it. I'll show you how you can see it. When you come out on the wheel card after you come from the front to the back, right? On the hanged man, the reflection, he's upside down. You come out on the wheel card right here. Just look at the wheel card now that I've showed you. Snake, dog man, sphinx. That's the reptilian brain, the mammalian brain, and the human neocortex. You following? And it just goes on from there. The symbolism is massive. Would love to walk you through, but I got like 5 minutes, so I gotta hurry. So you follow all the way through, you go through, it literally maps through the whole brain. And you follow all these archetypes, till finally, it creates this whole massive model of our psycho-spiritual cognition of consciousness. It's amazingly beautiful. And it all empirically aligns. And it creates this medium for the cube. For the high science. And the high science is a way that we can understand the cycle of consciousness. I'm going to walk you through that. Because just like I said, remember, the cube
can be converted to tarot, but it can then also be converted to astrology. Does that make sense? Through correspondence. Now that you have astrology, you now have astronomy. Because those signs are in those specific places. Does that make sense? Literally, they're now in north up, south down. Okay? Well, guess what? When you take that and you set it down at our ancient sites and go to a very specific day, it matches 1-to-1. And what it shows is that our sites helped us interpret the largest manuscript known to mankind, the sky. And it's the story of Orion and Ophiuchus, the two main points of this story, because that's the two main aspects, the hero and the healer. So, the idea that I'm going to share with you now is that you must read, in order to understand this, you must read the zodiac through precession. Precession is the path the sun takes over a 26,000 year period. Over the course of a year, the sun goes this way. Okay? Over precession, it goes backwards. And what it ends up doing is it talks about the coming online of the two hemispheres of our brain. You start in Virgo, the virgin, the beginning. We have a whole new cycle beginning. We're planned it, we're ready to initiate that. Then it's about Leo, the external king of the jungle, the identity self, the courage and the creativity, that left brain aspect of ourselves. Then it moves to the inner emotional world. We have to build these two aspects. And these are all ages. They're about 22,000 years long. Then it moves to Gemini. Now that we've got the inner and the outer established, we have the twins. The two hemispheres are at least built enough that we can start having communication and we can start functioning again. And right here, we cross over in from the northern aspect of the galaxy to the southern. And now the hero is finally online because we have the domesticated self-organization of group and culture that Taurus and the age of Taurus brings on. So that finally we have the Aries aspect of ourselves built. The hero's fully established. Our identity is there. Does that make sense? Then that is the hero's journey that we wrote for ourselves in the stars. That's the last 12,000 years of our lives. The next 12,000 years is what is really important. And we wrote a story there. And it's the journey back to the healer, Ophiuchus. Okay? I won't go into it, but it walks the whole thing where we have spiritual awakening with Pisces. We have Aquarius and consciousness finally being recognized. And then we have the structure and depth being written into the group to where finally we can have the heightened age and the journey of this great adventure realized through Sagittarius and the crossing over and the alignment with the center of the Milky Way galaxy where Ophiuchus is finally recognized again. Remember, we made those dots mean something. They mean nothing in nature till we connect them and put them in form. Till finally there's rebirth, renewal, and harmony again in Libra. You seeing that? So it becomes a big manuscript and the story of humanity. We had this 12,000 years ago at Saarburg. We have a man between two lions, and we have a man with hands raised and a bull. That's Orion and Ophiuchus. If you look at Orion has his hands raised, you see his hands raised? Here's he with the bull, here is he with the bull. Here's his transition throughout time in our stories and our narratives as we used this to develop and bring ourselves online. Ophiuchus, you can see he's got his hands across his body. We now see him as snakes. But before, you can see it at Saarburg, they saw him with his hands across his waist, like this. And they're not the only ones, it's all across the world. But you can see him, he becomes Mithra in the slaying of the bull, he becomes Christ, meditation, because this is a rest and digest state. This is a meditative state. That is how we access the memory that's stored in our genetics from that heightened age of the cycle. You can now see how throughout time we developed the structures and the hero developed from Enkidu. I have a whole thing, I'm sorry, that I'd love to tell you about. Enkidu is the wild man that the hunter recognizes when he looks into the water and sees the reflection. That's self-awareness coming online through the hunter. Göbekli Tepe, our oldest spiritual site. We're going to look at enclosure D, only because I got to hurry up, okay? This is the cycle of consciousness as mapped out. We have Satya Yuga. I've defined that we went through our first triplet, just like normal astrology breaks it up into three groups of four, or four groups of three. You can do the same thing in precession, where the first three, Virgo through Leo and Cancer, is the hunter coming online. That's what gets us to Gemini and Orion. Then that's the story of the hero. Then we go through the Hierophant and the remembering of the ancient wisdom. That's the Hierophant. And then we can move into the healer. Okay? Sagittarius is the important thing here. When we go to pillar 43, that is this pillar right here. We go to pillar 43. See this guy? It's the vulture. That's Sagittarius. That's Sagittarius with the sun disk. When you go to 12,000 BC or 11,000 BC, when this was built, and you go to the astronomy of it, Libra or Scorpio or Sagittarius, Scorpio, Libra, and Virgo, and right below Virgo, remember, is the snake, right? Right at the feet of that. The sun is aligning with Scorpio or with Sagittarius right at sunset. All four of those signs dead end into this sign on the horizon at sunset when they're going through it. And it marks the heightened age. You can go to my videos and see all of this. But this whole sign, this thing encompasses everything that I just told you. Scorpio marks the transformation. We've got Libra and Virgo that we talked about. We've got Orion, because they actually go around the site. This is an initiation tool. Orion, you see how this hand is up? And you see how he has an erect penis but no head? That's the lower domesticated man. Yeah. This other hand is probably up, but it's chipped now, right? So Orion gets on the back of Cygnus, and they take the journey in the morning, coming around to the domestication, there's the dog, of the reptilian brain. And it's through these ages. So if Sagittarius is the summer solstice at this time, then these are the other solstices and equinoxes. That is Virgo, Virgo. That is Gemini, and that is Pisces. And then there's the Milky Way. You can see them all marked here. Sagittarius, Virgo, Gemini, Pisces. You can see them all marked on the sign there. You can see correspondence of other sites at that same place in the same configurations. You can see how they're showing the sun on the horizon. So they're teaching the same thing that happened. Now what's important is the alignments at these sites. And I'm flying right in between at that sunset, right when Scorpio, Libra, Virgo, all of those come down on that point of pillar 43. Orion is rising, Ophiuchus is setting, right in the center alignment of these two main pillars. Okay? Right on here, there's a dog. That's Ursa Major. Because right behind it is Ursa Major at this same time of the sunset. Now, why that's important? Oh, and it's got all these I's and H's. When you extrapolate all this information and use this as a tool, what ends up happening is that alignment between Orion and Ophiuchus, at the site, over these ages, it shifts and it does this. And it goes from an H on the horizon to an I. And I've mapped it out all the way through here. So they projected out in the future the way. What's even more awesome is you can see this HH and then it becomes an I. It becomes an I at Gemini. And then at Gemini, you cross the galactic plane. So you cross the galactic plane at the man with hands raised. And then you have another I and an I of the lower descent pattern of consciousness. And there's Taurus and Aries, and that's the end of the descent. This is all that. I'm hurrying, I promise. I know, I'm going to be done. You can see it there. Why this is important. Why this is important is because it perfectly maps the galaxy.
Orion and Ophiuchus become the east and west point. There is a south and a north galactic of the plane. Literally, Ursa Major maps the northern galactic pole in modern astronomy. Pisces maps the southern galactic pole right at Sculptor. So they have a perfect alignment of the Milky Way galaxy. And what ends up happening is it becomes a large storage device for the sky. Okay? And I'm going to extrapolate it for you here. They took the brain, 2 hemispheres of the brain. It gets expressed out through the language. Then we have the larger tarot expression level. Then there's the galactic level, perfectly separated with the hemispheres with the Milky Way. Till finally it's the same map, as above, so below. And it shows, because the cycle of consciousness is a 26,000 year period, the only way we can know about that cycle is because they inherited it, Göbekli Tepe. The only way you can see a cycle is you got to see it twice, right? At the very least. That means they inherited a memory that's over 60,000 years old. And it pushes our whole understanding of history and astronomy, and bam! It doesn't show up at Göbekli Tepe alone. On the summer solstice, the same alignments. You can go all across the world over 12,000 years and see the same freaking thing. Dendera, literally, it unlocks Dendera, because what ends up happening is where Orion and Ophiuchus are, there's these little things on the outside thing. That is the galactic plane of the Milky Way, and those things are stored in that same alignment. They knew this same information. When you look at Stonehenge, on the summer solstice, Stonehenge is built for the summer solstice. It has the same exact pattern of Ursa Major, Pisces in the south, Cygnus and Ophiuchus and Orion over there. And it's even got station stones that mark them. And in the berms, there are holes in the berms that match where they're coming up, so they could teach this information. It's at the Paracas Candelabra. Chaco Canyon has the T structures in the same north-south orientation. And these things right here, the middle things that are the circle and the square, when I talked to a shaman of that tradition, he said that means deep space. Orion and Ophiuchus mark deep space. Orion marks our connection looking away from the center of the Milky Way galaxy. Ophiuchus marks our alignment with the center of the Milky Way galaxy. It shows the path of the initiate and the understanding of the harmonization of the 2 hemispheres of our brain and how to navigate it. Mithra tells the same story of the 4, same thing splitting. Leonardo da Vinci painted it into the Last Supper. Look at the background. In the heightened age, when we're coming into heightened, the background is in light. Christ, the center, the heightened age, is emboldened in the light, and then we're moving into the darkness. The torch is down, the torch is up. This happens in Mexico in the Paracas Candelabra as well. They have a man looking down, they have a man looking up. I'm ending here, I promise. Same thing all the way through all of our structures. Looking up, looking down, Cygnus, all of these throughout the world, 12,000 years, and I can't go into my work. I won't go into it.
So let me say this.
I'm very, very sorry.
And I am too. But what I want